For All Mankind is a rare and exceptional example of alternate history that makes our own world feel like it's the contrived fictional timeline. Throughout the 50s and 60s, American popular culture was bathed in a narrative of the impending future of space exploration. Moon bases and Mars landings, space cities and giant orbital power stations, space-based manufacturing, an endless frontier. This narrative ran parallel to the real world, with a space race of increasingly ambitious undertakings culminating with the moon landing in 1969. Then, after a few more lunar excursions, we quit. The Russians quit. We all just decided to go around in circles for the next 50 years. Something has always felt off to me about manned space exploration essentially ending in the early 70s, as though we had this bold future laid out for us and it was abruptly snatched away. For All Mankind gives us a glimpse of that other timeline, the one where we didn't wuss out. It begins with the first moon landing. I remember it differently. Just as the Soviets putting the first man in space forced the United States to up the ante by declaring a moon mission, being beaten by the Ruskies again spurs America to declare a bigger goal, one vague enough to allow for some setbacks. But then the Soviets land a woman on the moon just to show us how fair and egalitarian their socialist paradise is. Well, America has women too. And we put a few of them through the Mercury astronaut program as a PR stunt. And so the big shots at NASA decide that they're going to take a few of them and turn them into real astronauts. Take that, Russia. And so we get our cast of characters for the first 3 seasons, set between 1969 and the early 90s, with a 4th season on the way set in the early aughts. The first several episodes are a bit of a slow burn. It's a stretch I call Fake Apollo. It gives a progressively more askew version of events. But once the Americans land on the moon, it kicks the space race into high gear. Resources are found to support a base, Americans and Soviets jockey for position, and in a few cases, actually fight. The Cold War extends out from Earth and becomes more direct. There are no proxies to do our fighting on the moon, so Americans and Soviets are in direct conflict, sometimes quite violently. It shows us the Cold War made personal. It becomes a struggle between 2 groups of people all alone on the moon. They know each other's names. They know that they live in fragile eggs surrounded by hard vacuum. It reminds us that the Cold War, for all its bluster and absurdity, was deadly serious. Good thing we moved past the threat of nuclear war, eh? As the show progresses, like most alternate history, it suffers from a bit of timeline drag that becomes increasingly jarring as it gets away from that point of divergence. It's not really noticeable in the first season, set in '69 in the early 70s, but by season 3 in the 1990s, it's really odd to hear familiar songs on the radio, as though popular culture is unchanged by the wider divergence in history around it. As an example of what I mean, the 90s had kind of an undercurrent of being adrift, of losing our way. We didn't have the Soviets as a villain anymore, but we also didn't have a defining narrative of who we were. We had no real vision or story. Francis Fukuyama's end of history again. It was the bastard decade between the materialistic 1980s and the future of the 21st century that we were supposed to be looking forward to. And I think that sense of being adrift was a big factor in the rise of the grunge scene with its, shabby, unrefined aesthetic. It's turning not caring into an art form. In For All Mankind's more vibrant and optimistic 1990s, I don't think that Nirvana would be nearly as popular. But I can forgive the inclusion of pop culture nostalgia and real-world events because, for the most part, they do it well. For example, in 1983, the Soviet Union shot down Korean Air Flight 007. The show's writers worked it in by making it relevant to the plot both in a geopolitical and a character sense, in a way that was organic to the story and didn't feel jimmied in there. For All Mankind's writers have given the story a lot of thought. The historical extrapolation is mostly solid, and the characters feel like real people most of the time. Even when we see them making stupid decisions, we understand how they could. It's not forced just so that the show can happen. It also has to be mentioned that they couldn't very well make a fictional history exclusively about a bunch of white guys. So they came up with story threads that logically and believably introduced women and minorities into the astronaut corps. Every character, regardless of their background, has a reason for being there that makes sense. It makes for much better storytelling than the clunky, forced diversity that we see in so many shows today, where every office, ship's crew, or medieval village has to match the demographics of a London tube station. But the core of the show is that it gives us a look at that other history of the space race, one where both participants kept running and trying to outdo each other. It shows us permanent bases on the moon in the 80s, manned missions to Mars in the 90s, commercial space stations, cheap and abundant fusion energy. And it shows us that these things don't come without cost. For example, with the rise of fusion power, coal and oil workers are facing obsolescence and unemployment. Of course, it is television, so there are some things that feel forced to create drama. For example, overweighting the significance of homosexuality in the 1990s political landscape. Or the story thread where they say North Korea, but we know they really want to say China. But even with its flaws, something about that world feels right. As though we're the ones living in the alternate timeline, the fake history, the one where, for reasons the writers hand wave away, we just collectively decided that space is lame and windmills are better than fusion. For All Mankind shows us an alternate recent past that is at times more dangerous, but also more optimistic than the one we live through. Progressive without insane zealotry, a space program far less risk-averse without being reckless, a Cold War that channeled energies into building instead of undermining. And it forces us to ask ourselves, what the hell happened? You'll get very different answers depending on who you ask, and most of them have some truth at their core. Apollo 17, the final moon landing of the program, happened in December of 1972. The US economy, despite being strong for the year, was teetering on the edge of recession. The Vietnam War was being drawn down as a failure, costing a couple $100 billion depending on how you do your accounting. This is 1970s billions, by the way. The Great Society programs were turning out to be significantly more expensive and far less effective than promised. And the moon just wasn't that exciting anymore. The government needed to spend money on war and graft more than rockets and pictures of craters. It's also worth stating plainly that most of the world's wealth is controlled by a very small group of people. People who benefit greatly from Earth's economy being a closed system. An open frontier with asteroid mining and cheap fusion power would threaten the entrenched stability of the current batch of self-described elites. And of course, there are people who argue that no one ever went to the moon for reasons such as the Van Allen belts making it impossible. To which I can only say that, okay, from my vantage point, I have to concede that it's possible that the moon landing was faked. But to do it convincingly, you'd still have to build a big-ass rocket and send it to the moon. And you'd have to have your fake astronauts play along with the story for decades. And the Van Allen belts don't work like a homogeneous wall of lethal radiation, so it's almost easier to shoot your fake moon landing on the damn moon. For All Mankind shows us a history that could have been, and what we could still do if we shake ourselves out of the Malthusian zero-sum stupor that our society has allowed itself to become mired in. It's a cultural echo of a time when we had more vision, when we were willing to do great things, as President Kennedy said, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. For All Mankind is a needle in the eye of our cultural assumptions about progress. Since the 1950s, every generation of Americans has grown up with a broad assumption that technology steadily improves and that space is a new frontier that the next generation will travel to and potentially work and live in. And yet, that never really happens. Whether it's Disney's Man in Space specials of the 1950s or today's near-future sci-fi like The Expanse, there's a disconnect between the future we expect and the one we actually make. Maybe we need to broaden our vision and extend our reach. Maybe the only way to solve our problems is through growth and innovation, not the lowering of standards that so many of the cultish political movements of today demand. For All Mankind shows us a reflection of ourselves as just a little bit better than we are. It's worth a look.